Hello and welcome to the latest installment of Academia SG's Singapore Studies Junior Scholar Seminar. My name is Joanne Liao and I'm an Associate Editor with Academia SG. Today we are really pleased to welcome Dominic Na, who is a PhD candidate in the English Language and Literature Academic Group at the National Institute of Education at Nanyang Technological University. His BA is in English Literature and his MA in World Literature are both from the University of Warwick. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about his research. Dominic's doctoral thesis examines student responses towards ethically oriented literature pedagogies. And his work has been recently published in Changing English, and he has forthcoming research which will appear in English in Australia and the Routledge Companion to Literature and Social Justice later this year. So we're delighted to have him here today to share some of his research on student responses to representations of poverty and privilege in Singapore poetry. As Dominic will explain, literature educators have adopted various pedagogies to balance aesthetic and ethical engagements of text. However, his work takes us into the Singaporean classroom to directly examine student responses. And responding to Dominic's seminar paper, we're honored to have Dr. Brenton Dakey, who is Emeritus Professor in the Faculty of Arts and Education at Deakin University, Melbourne, Australia. He has published widely in the fields of English education, teacher education, and Australian literary studies, and he's currently co-editor of Changing English Studies in Culture and Education, and a member of the editorial advisory board of Pedagogy, Culture, and Society. His books include Literary Praxis, a conversational inquiry into the teaching of literature, Confronting Practice, classroom investigations into language and learning, and Becoming a Teacher of Language and Literacy. His latest publication is a co-authored book titled Literary Knowing and the Making of English Teachers, the Role of Literature in Shaping English Teachers' Professional Knowledge and Identities. So we really have a world-class expert in the room to really engage with Dominic's work. So just a rundown of what to expect. Our session will last for approximately an hour, with Dominic speaking for about 25 to 30 minutes, Brenton responding for about 5 to 10 minutes before we open it up for a more general discussion. So please feel free to place your comments or questions in the chat at that point, and I will read them out loud to the participants. So without further ado, I turn it over to Dominic.
Hey, hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Joanne, for that. Allow me to just maybe share my slide, my pictures on there as well. Everyone able to see my slides? Yeah. Okay. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Joanne, again. Thank you to Associate Professor Cherian as well for helping to organize this, and also to Emeritus Professor Brendan Dakey for coming on this morning as well, and for all of us here, for you taking an interest in my work this morning. As introduced, I am Dominic. I am a third-year PhD candidate at the English Language and Literature Academic Group at NIE. And maybe just a little bit about me first before I start my sharing about my work. The issue of poverty and privilege is something quite tied up with my relationship with literature as well. So growing up as a student from a lower middle income background, I grew up with very little social and cultural capital at home. So discovering literature in school was a way for me to learn about the human condition, and in ways that were very different from what my parents grew up in. So my father was a security system technician. My mom was a full-time homemaker, and now she's a part-time school bus attendant. So literature is quite foreign to my parents' education. So after studying an unlikable protagonist in James Coetzee's Disgrace at the A levels, the problem of empathy has been a long-standing question in my journey. So throughout university and my young adult life, I think I've still struggled to reconcile the elitist associations of literary study and my own lower and middle income background. So one way of reconciling this is really through my PhD work and in secondary level education. So today, that's what I'm going to be sharing about, how students talk about representations of poverty and privilege in Singapore poetry. So I will go over what ethical literature pedagogies are in the West and in Singapore. a little bit about my theoretical framework this morning, drawing a bit from Levinasian ethical criticism, and then a bit about my supervisor Suzanne Choo's concept of Confucian cosmopolitanism, bit about my methodology and data sources, the stances of student responses, the three stances that I'll be sharing about, and 5 episodes of discourse where my findings will come from, and finally closing with 2 recommendations for literature teachers. So let's make a start about ethics and literature education. So ethically oriented literature pedagogy since the 80s, I would say, developments in lit education at the secondary level have really taken this ethical turn. So students are oriented to be active and dialogic participants in class. And we're trying to really balance talking about the text and also making ethical claims. So in the US and the UK, we have a lot of multicultural literature. We also have paradigms of global and world literature. Next. In the US particularly, there is a strong drive to do critical literacy and social justice. So with areas of critical race theory being applied into literature classrooms, social justice pedagogy as well. And in Australia, what I've been learning more recently is that there's been a call to diversify text selection, to introduce Asian, Aboriginal, LGBTQ representations in the classroom. And what about existing student responses to inequality in literature classes, just to scope it down a little bit? There's not very many, but there is one body of scholarship from the US that speaks to this. So Amanda Thine and her collaborators, they have actually studied students in a school that serves both middle and working class communities. And what they found is quite interesting, really. As students discuss, among other texts, Dorothy Allison's Bastard Out of Carolina, which really explores poverty and abuse in a vulnerable white family. What they found was that students similar SES, socioeconomic status, they ended up actually reinforcing common myths rather than challenging them in their student talk. And students also started to perform their class identities with each other, middle class, working class, and that actually had the effect of closing down explicit discussions of poverty and oppression. So that's very interesting for me to think about as well. In Singapore, actually, when we look at how what teachers' beliefs and practices are, there have been consistent indications that teachers find moral and ethical orientations to be important objectives in teaching literature. Most recently, with a nationwide survey in 2019-2020, with 232 literature teachers, where empathizing with others and engaging with issues in the world was the 3rd and 4th highest objectives for teachers in Singapore. At the same time, we also have this issue of assessment where there's a strong focus on text-centric and reader response questions that limits this. So a lot of the times we will find that the ethical is more secondary in nature, and responding to the text and how you respond as a reader comes to the fore. Having said that, the 2019 National Lit Curriculum in Singapore has explicitly put out an objective of developing empathetic and global thinkers. And this curriculum objective was actually also brought about through consultative findings from teachers as well. So at the same time, even if we wanted to push for these ethical pedagogies, Suzanne Choo and Liu Pei have actually also pointed out some challenges of enacting such pedagogies in the classroom. What are some of them? How do we address reductive responses? How do we avoid reinforcing cultural superiority? And this is when students in the class are talking about the referent other. Most of us here may be familiar with the idea of the other, but specifically the referent other is that fictional other in the text, who as an imagined construct makes references and points to real others in the world undergoing similar forms of injustice. So sort of like a proxy in a way. And sometimes we do think of literature classes as a rehearsal space for students to think through real world issues. So let me take us through my theoretical framework and what I mean by Levinasian ethical criticism and Confucian cosmopolitanism, and where this all leads us today. So I'll start first with Emmanuel Levinas' first philosophy. So he is a Lithuanian-born Jewish philosopher, and one of his biggest contributions to philosophy is this fundamental idea of the ethical responsibility to the other, which comes first above all else. And what this really means is that he wants to challenge the imperialism of the same, where we sort of impose our views of other people onto them. So this has some connotations for literature criticism, and then literature education. So there's two steps that we need to make. Ethical criticism as a field in literary studies is not often talked about. It's quite scattered. It's quite a scattered field. So I'm looking at the strand in ethical criticism that really takes up Levinas's philosophy. And one of these people that does that is Derek Attridge, who approaches literary texts. And his idea is that we look at the text as a stranger rather than the text as a friend, as other critics like Wayne Booth or Martha Nussbaum might think. So Derek Attridge really says that, okay, we need to look at the text as someone who is completely other to us. We have to surrender our own goals and views in deference to the other. And where that leads us is that when it comes to reading text, we have to look at our own ethical interruptions of our own prejudices. So we have to destabilize and deconstruct a set of norms and habits that give me or us the world. And that's kind of really what we do hope for when we read literature as well, for the other in the text to sort of change us and the way that we view the world. So then how does this translate from the private reading space, as Suzanne Choo would say, to the public space of the literature classroom? Because there are very distinct differences. Me reading at home versus me talking about it in the classroom setting, two very different contexts. So this is where I take my supervisor, Suzanne Choo's concept and really specifically focusing on Confucian cosmopolitanism. So where I have to start is with Choo's cosmopolitan literature pedagogy. It's one that encourages a commitment towards understanding others, particularly those who are in the minority or those who hold different beliefs from us. Where we then go is that Choo is quite concerned that schools are a place that socializes students into obedience. So for instance, maybe we always look to our teachers for the right answer, and that sometimes happens in literature classrooms. So hence teachers need to inculcate ethical resistance. We need to develop our concerns beyond just ourselves and relating to the teacher authority, what the teacher wants, and to go beyond that into diverse others in the world. And where this takes us is that we then adopt a couple of key Confucian principles. Firstly, we look at the idea of humaneness or ren in Mandarin. And really where this comes from is we have to, let me just take a step back and briefly mention this idea of phronesis from Aristotle, the idea of practical wisdom and its true routines, which I'll speak about in a moment, where these dispositions are going to be inculcated. So not just knowledge, but the processes in the classroom as well. And this is really where we're going. So these are quite crucial. And let's focus a bit on humaneness. So from a Confucian perspective, Choo surmises that one's relationship with others should be governed by empathic reciprocity. What does that mean? And it's based on the negative golden rule, right? Do not impose on others what you yourself do not want others to impose on you. And for Choo, so this relation between self and other can be seen as a sort of cosmopolitan love, which is encapsulated in Ren, that's rooted in everyday relations, and then it just extends out into the world. And to practice this Ren, we need rituals of respectful interaction, which would be Li. So for Confucius, moral development is determined through everyday actions, right? So it's not just, I know what is moral, but I need to embody it and live it out. And it's consistently performed in rituals, which when we shift it to a classroom space, helps us cultivate ethical dispositions. So now this takes us to what ethical dispositions? I'm going to focus on three key values that Choo picks out: empathy, which would be a deep and engaged understanding of others by putting oneself in the shoes of others. We have hospitality, valuing different values and practices of others. And it's also this idea of being willing to suspend judgment. And lastly, responsibility, to value the other to the extent of feeling a sense of responsibility and accountability for the other. And what you'll notice is that these three ethical values do have their traces from Levinasian ethical criticism, this idea of the infinite responsibility to the other. And I want to focus on a couple of key routines to cultivate ethical values, which serve as the context for the episodes that I choose in these classrooms. The first are listening routines that Choo picks out. And this is where students are socialized to listen attentively to their peers' views, not just their teachers. And second will be bridge building routines, where the idea is relational learning, but more importantly, it's to invite students to share about themselves and to witness and appreciate each other's experiences. So I will touch on these again when I talk about the context of the classrooms. But for now, where this is going is that there are three stances of student responses that I'm hoping to frame, right? And I'm going back to Derek Attridge on his idea of responsible readings to practice ethical interruptions. So the three stances going to walk us through them. The first one would be when students are resistant and self-centered. So this means when they are kind of imposing a very common meaning on something that is uncommon, right? Maybe they have a preconceived notion and they apply it. So this means you disregard the context entirely of the text, and there is a tendency to box up, categorize, and objectify the other. So that's where we are when students are very resistant. Then we have a situation where students may be receptive but self-centered. So this is where you might find this familiar, where we take ourselves as the reference point to understand another. And sometimes we may presume empathy, but we kind of still overlook our own prejudices. So it's kind of a middle ground. And this is the space where the work of disrupting what preconceived notions we have is in process. So rather than see it as something hypocritical, I do see it as a place where people are in the process of unlearning. And lastly, we have a receptive and other-centered stance. And this is in some ways the ideal, where we surpass our preconceived notions of the other, where we let the other speak to us and be open to change, to be changed by otherness, be it representations of real people. So with that in mind, I'm just going to give us a sense of how I'm analyzing these classroom conversations and the data sources as well. So firstly, where this all started, where my data comes from are case studies of classrooms from a literature unit that was co-designed by myself and also three literature teachers. And the unit was explicitly based on privilege and inequality in Singapore poetry. So this was ratified by NTU IRB. And the three teachers from two mainstream government schools that serve a lower middle to middle income catchment. And I'm going to focus on Jacqueline and Rachel. I know in my abstract, I originally wanted to compare the two secondary 3 grade 9 classes. But I found that Kyle's classes, these are all pseudonyms, by the way. Kyle's classes were not as dialogic as I originally thought they were when I started to look closely. So I focused on Jacqueline's classes and Rachel's classes when they were talking about these two poems. So Jacqueline's class has 14 students. The Sec 4, grade 10, which means that they have known each other for a year. And in Rachel's class, they're Sec 3, secondary 3, the 25 of them, and they've just come together. And this was done during COVID at various weeks between January and May 2021. So a bit about the two poems. The first is Candles, and this is just a scan excerpt by Alvin Pang, who I believe is in the room now also. So Candles is really a poem that depicts a poverty-stricken Singaporean family. And through a English-speaking child persona who steals candles from a church to help siblings study at night. One thing that I think the teachers didn't really manage to bring across was that the timeline of this, because this is not something which Singaporean students might see to be feasibly happening in 2020, 2023, 2021 at the time, but it's more one generation ago. So that's Candles that has a representation of poverty. And on the flip side, we have hashtag First World Problems by Loh Guan Liang. And it's really a poem that depicts a socio-economically privileged and entitled persona that's just really complaining about minor everyday inconveniences and infractions. Simplifying it, some people might call them today as a Karen. That's in American pop culture reference. So what is interesting is that socioeconomic inequality in Singapore schools is something that the students in the classes would be at least to some degree aware of. I don't have very strong data to back this up because I didn't interview students about their social class. But what is likely to be, what I believe I can assume is that students will be aware that parents' education levels have important effects on adolescents' educational aspiration. And what this means is that where your parents have studied has an impact on how you feel about your self-esteem, your worries about things like finance, and also what educational streams you move into. On the other hand, when you look at things like primary school enrollment, privileged parents do gain admissions advantages, especially to perceived elite schools in Singapore. And this is it's sort of a systemic way of reproducing privilege also that does occur. And those are part of conversations in Singapore. So what I do notice is that also public discourse also tends to perpetuate what Teo Yuan says, believes that low-income persons have a tendency to make bad choices that perpetuate their poor conditions. So pinning the blame squarely on the individual rather than looking at something broader socially or systemically. So this is the context that we're setting up. The classroom discourse that I'm looking at, I put all these audio recorders in all the student small groups, and when I look at the transcriptions, I'm looking at turns of talk where they're talking about the referent other. And specifically, I'm looking at the uptake. So when they're integrating their ideas over different turns of talk. So in Rachel's class, we have Socratic circle discussions, which are these they're supposed to be student-led discussions, where students are supposed to bring in their own ideas and dialogue, and they are the center of the conversation. But in Rachel's class, what I noticed is that because she's socializing them into this routine, she sometimes has to intervene, which means that student uptake often comes off the back of Rachel revoicing what other students say, or even bouncing off something that she interjects. In Jacqueline's class, they're more comfortable with one another after a year. So in small group discussions, students are more free and comfortable with themselves as they talk about the two poems. So let's look at the findings, the yummy part, really. So what I noticed was this very interesting split when I decided to choose the classes where they were talking about these two poems. And there is quite a distinct divide between rational and emotional responses. And I'll start with the rational ones because they tend to fall under the episodes where they're talking about representations of poverty. And this is where students are hospitably defending utilitarian acts of desperation. I'm going to slowly unpack that over time. Excuse me, I have a bit of a dry cough. It's been going on for a while. Hope everyone's okay out there too. What I want to do is I want to look at a couple of episodes of how this plays out. I will start first. So this is the poem Candles. And a lot of students tend to judge the culpability of the persona in terms of stealing the candles from the nearby church to help their family. So they tend to really focus on the consequences about this act. And let's look at some of the discourse. So first in Rachel's class, a lot of talk was centered on qualifying the Robin Hood analogy. This is very interesting. So the student Pavi first talks about this idea that the fact that he steals candles shows that those who are desperate will steal from those who have things, right? So that's her defense of the persona's motivations for the candle theft. And Rachel revoices this, and she says that, so you're almost suggesting that the poem is suggesting Robin Hood behavior. And so another student, Brandon, then brings up the two premises of what counts as Robin Hood behavior: stealing from the rich and helping the poor. But he has some issues. He's trying to like probe and qualify these two premises. So Brandon goes, but he stole the candle from what? The freaking church, right? And then to which two students start to really qualify this analogy. Jared goes, the church are rich, right? So that's okay. That's one kind of impression of churches. Not all. So that's one way that the analogy is starting to get qualified in the uptake. And later on, Brandon goes to the other one. But he's helping himself. He's not helping the poor. Robin Hood helps other people, so not help himself. To which another student, Zane, goes, Robin Hood is also poor. And when his classmates are going is really when you justify the relevance and accuracy of the Robin Hood analogy, it's really also trying to defend this idea that the poverty-stricken persona is justified in both the theft and as a beneficiary at the same time. So I found this to be quite a rational kind of way of defending and hospitably defending the other here. And in Jacqueline's class, a very similar point comes through as well. So what we see is a utilitarian defense when the student Kavita, she sets up this hypothetical example. Right now, if I say it's a good reason for it, do you think there's like a good reason actually like justifies like stealing? For example, your mom is sick, she needs medicine, then you steal from the. So from here, what she's doing is the students are considering the culpability again of the hypothetical and literary representations of theft. So they entertain what we in ethics would call deontological judgments, right? This idea of universal principles. It's still stealing, Kavita says, right? And we also project legal authorities as unforgiving and unsympathetic, which is interesting. Shilin says if you get caught, right, they don't care about your situation. Shilin is then able to suspend her judgment about the immorality of stealing. So near the bottom. Okay, I don't think it's fine to steal, but I understand why she would do it. And this is where students are starting to suspend their own judgment also. So Charmaine and Kavita, this is a small group of 3 students. They both support her hospitable stance, right? By weighing in on the persona's altruism against the inconsequential loss of a few candles, right? Like they have abundance of candles, just take some, what are they going to do? Like wait for the candles. So what I find is that students are suspending one's judgment about the immorality of stealing here, which is quite intriguing. Where this goes in the whole class discussion is that Shilin then goes on to say that, before that, one moment. Yes, so then the students start to reject these deontological judgments, right? They say that alleviating the dire material circumstances is really sufficient to justify the theft. When you got problems, you don't care, just do what you want. Honestly, if you need to get something done, just get it done. And in the whole class discussion, this is where Shilin then tells the whole class, I think that the main concern is not about having the light, whether she steal or not, whether it's justifiable, because they have morals, but they also have needs. And this is where she seems to synthesize multiple ethical perspectives and stances. But what I find the limitation here is that underneath it, students do still assume that the desperation of poverty redeems the responsibility of individual actions. And there seems to be a larger absence of critiquing systemic inequality. Now, granted, this is a poem which doesn't always bring out, doesn't always show anything systemic that happens. So sometimes this might veer into the territory of speculation. But this is something that I find to be related to how the concept of poverty is being framed in the classroom to begin with. I'm going to move to emotional responses to representations of privilege. So this is a contrast. The responses are a whole range of emotions that's going on in classrooms. And a lot of them tend to center around these few lines from the poem. The persona is in what's probably Starbucks. And this happens, right? The barista, she even got my name wrong and made my drink cooler than a smoking barrel. I suspect the barista is a decaf terrorist. A lot of conversations seem to center around these few lines. Let's look at one of them. The first one is an empathetic projection of injustice. And where this happens is in Rachel's class in the Socratic Circle discussion. And students are bringing across this juxtaposition of the barista as someone that's benign and the terrorist as someone that's malign. But they can't quite get to the significance of it, the so what. And so Rachel interjects with this. Imagine you are a survivor of a terrorist attack. Then you hear this teenager going, oh my God, I suspect the barista is a decaf terrorist. And now you hear me ranting about my venti Starbucks. And what this does is that the uptake from this is students starting to project the feelings of humiliation, as Bernice, the student, would say, right? Would the survivor be humiliated that this terrorist attack that they experience is being compared to a wrong order? What I find interesting is that Bernice's other-centered empathetic response, it does take up Rachel's invitation, and it projects an indignant response of appropriating the severity of terrorism for something so trivial, right? But at the same time, you can also see that Rachel's subsequent reply is tied up with expressions of what seems to be righteous indignation, right? I would just want to give this child a slap if I were a terrorist survivor. So responding to juxtaposition and hyperbole still stays close to the text and also can extend out into ethical considerations as well. Then we move to outrage, right? So students going, in Jacqueline's class, you give us poems that don't make us angry in the morning. This person's a bitch. He's so petty, he's so angsty, he's so judgmental, he's so petty. And students are just feeling so much outrage when they're talking about this poem. And what this tends to center around is focusing on his trivial complaints and his entitled behavior, right? So student uptake really clusters around rejecting and rebuffing the entitled behavior of the persona. What then Jacqueline does is she comes to the group and she goes, okay, I want to ask you guys something. Are you angry if we take him literally? What if you don't take him literally? And this is where the shift from an immersive stance to a critical stance comes through. And what happens is that the students start to realize that, oh, okay, the poet is onto something here. Oh, he's trolling, all right? He is also trying to get readers to evoke these responses in the reader also. And then students start to be assuaged, and then they critically consider the poet's craft and effect from then on out. And lastly, we have this private resistance of political correctness, where students go, okay, this is actually Kavita, which we saw earlier, and now when she looks at first world problems, she goes, why are you saying that? I can't even say that someone made my order wrongly. Like, this is what I don't like about this kind of topic. They make it seem like so I cannot complain about this kind of stuff. And this is very interesting because this is in a private small group setting. She never says this to the whole class. And this exasperated complaint about what seems to be political correctness is that she's really challenging the emotional rules of the classroom. This implication that is maybe unsaid, that we're supposed to respond in a certain way to poverty or privilege when we present these in the classroom, that they are right and tasteful responses. So this is something that I think is really important to pay attention to as well, as I move into some of the implications to a close.
Thanks, Dominic. I was just going to ask you to wrap it up because to save time. Thanks.
Yeah. So I'm going to go very quickly on the implications. So just two, and I can do it in 1 to 2 minutes. Analytical plurality and emotional rules. When we discuss poverty, it seems that there's this tendency for rational judgments. But if we don't want it to become didactic, then how do we go about it? One suggestion can be to choose 5 ethical lenses for analytical plurality. We take on board a range of different ways of looking at ethical judgments. So that's briefly one way that I would recommend teachers go. The other way is when privilege. There's a tendency for a spectrum of emotional responses. And what this is important, and why I put the picture of Dead Poets Society here, is that we might get the sense that there is an expected way to respond passionately, dispassionately in the classroom, and teachers can be more cognizant of these rules that they are setting up in the classroom so that they can entertain alternative views. So really, I hope that my work helps make the case for studying student responses. Then we can help teachers manage these rational and emotional discourse in classrooms. So thanks very much. I know my time is up now. I can share the references with people if they're interested. Just a few quick people to acknowledge. Nanyang Technological University Research Scholarship, which I'm on. My thesis supervisor, Suzanne Choo. The Academia SG team for helping to organize this and for promoting it, and my discussant as well, Professor Dick this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dominic. And we'll hand it over to Brenton, Dr. Dickey.
First, I have to say that I've been down with a cold, and so my presentation may be a little bit painful to listen to with regard to my delivery, but we'll see how we go. Thanks, Dominic. And are we set up properly here? I was a bit concerned about the buttons I've pressed. Joanne, is that right? Oh,
yes, we can see you and hear you. So perfect.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Right, thanks, Dominic. I'm glad to have been invited to respond to your paper. It's timely to look at the way students engage with representations of poverty and privilege, given that we're living in a world where there's such a huge gap between wealth and poverty, not least through the radically different educational opportunities made available to different communities through the schooling their children receive. Can schooling, and specifically the curriculum and pedagogy of subject English, be a vehicle for enabling students to become sensitised to these issues? Isn't there a paradox here, given that, as theorists like Althusser and Bourdieu have shown us, schooling is one of the main vehicles through which class divisions are reproduced in capitalist societies? Similar questions could be posed with respect to the particular focus of your paper, namely the role that a literary education might play in enabling students to gain a perspective on themselves and the world around them. I'm thinking in particular of how theorists like Bourdieu and Eagleton, or at least the early Eagleton, have characterised literature as an elite pursuit, as a privileged indulgence that is all about feeling good about yourself, about cultivating a refined sensibility that is hopelessly out of touch with the huge questions confronting us. The enormity of the challenges society currently faces can easily drive one to a point of despair. Marred in a sense of the ineffectuality of our actions, it's easy to succumb to the pessimism of not taking any action at all. So I always find it heartening when educators like yourself invite us to refocus on the day-to-day exchanges of classroom settings, particularly when educators give children and adolescents an opportunity to engage in interpretive conversations around poems and other literary texts of the kind you presented in your paper. I'm reminded of Hannah Arendt's exhortation that education should be about enabling children to undertake something new, something unforeseen by us, about preparing them for the task of renewing a common world beyond the world as adults see it. Arendt's standpoint seems to me to be in accord with the dialogical spirit of your paper and your belief in the potential of the sociability of classroom settings to open up insights that can surprise us as educators. You've granted the conversations that occur around literary texts within classroom settings status as interpretive conversations in which the subjectivities of all those involved are crucially at play. Those conversations are not simply preparation for some kind of real or authentic engagement with text later in life, but authentic encounters that can be of immense significance to those participating in them. This is how they are often remembered long after these encounters have taken place. You are, in short, taking the students seriously as interlocutors in an authentic exchange of viewpoints. You could call these conversations literary events, a term that is used in different but similar ways by Louise Rosenblatt and Terry Eagleton, that's the older Eagleton, to characterise how literary texts unfold through readers engaging with them. Rosenblatt in particular shows how through reading literary texts, young people can confront dimensions of their subjectivities when the values and beliefs they hold can become a focus for inquiry, both through their solitary reading and their conversations with others, when together they try to construct meaning from what they've read. That said, there are a couple of aspects of your paper I would like to query, which seem to me to be in conflict with the dialogical stance that you are espousing and the way this translates into, to quote your abstract, a continuum of three stances of how students practice ethical interruptions of their prejudices towards others, which in turn leads you to classify their responses as resistance and self-centered, receptive yet self-centered, and finally receptive and other-centered stances. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, But to me, it seems to highlight a problem, namely the way that educational researchers tend to impose their analytical categories on classroom settings without reflexively acknowledging that those categories can never fully comprehend the complexities of what they're observing. There is, if I can borrow from Levinas, always a need to step back from the pretension of ever fully knowing another person. You yourself summarise Levinas's philosophy as inspiring a stance that is concerned with overcoming reduction, simplifying and objectifying of the other by language that imposes a comprehension of others, or what Levinas calls the imperialism of the same. Bakhtin makes a similar point when he remarks that in a human being there is always something that only he himself can reveal in a free act of self-consciousness and discourse, something that does not submit to an externalizing second-hand definition. This means cultivating a disposition that attends to the rich particularities of what occurs, in this case, the exchanges between these students, including details that may seem discrepant or indeed that challenge the analytical framework you're bringing to the analysis. And that's not meant to be a damning criticism. I wouldn't be saying these things if I didn't feel there were sufficient signs within your paper of a sensibility that's open to these criticisms. You could hardly be expected to resist discriminating between the responses of the students and teachers involved in these settings when such a judgment seems warranted. Yet I also think it's necessary to resist a classifying mentality, especially when it takes the form of a continuum of responses that culminate in a model of literary reading that you wish to privilege. A more provisional stance would be more in accord with the dialogical openness that otherwise characterises your paper. Here's my other criticism, and then I'll stop. It's quite understandable that you'd want to ride the wave of what announces itself as a new way to read literary texts, namely what you call the ethical turn in literary education. But I nonetheless feel that we should cast a critical eye on a tendency to think of the history of English education in the form of a series of paradigms or models, a famous example of which is the opening chapter to John Dixon's Growth Through English. It's probably inevitable that each new theoretical innovation should involve wringing out the old and ringing in the new. Yet such a disposition often runs the risk of rendering you blind to the insights of major theorists whom you deem to be old hat because they exemplify a standpoint that you imagine you've transcended. For all the remarkably valuable insights you might take from a Robert Eggleston or a Derek Attridge or a Suzanne Choo, there are theorists from the past whom you might usefully employ to refine your analysis of classroom exchanges and how students construct meanings from literary texts within classroom settings. I'm thinking in particular of the remarkable work of Louise Rosenblatt, which can't be just categorised as reader response. The books that she's written really repay attention. But there are also other theories, and I think what she's saying is actually congruent with the kind of analysis you're conducting here. And I'm also thinking of other theorists. In Australia, we often think of Ian Reid, who wrote an excellent book called The Making of Literature, which focuses explicitly on the ways students make meaning from text within classroom settings. That all of those texts could be broadly located within a field of inquiry that is focused on the ways meanings get constructed within classroom settings that are relevant to what you're trying to achieve here. But having said that, I also will affirm the way you're focusing on those classroom exchanges and the subtlety of the analysis that you presented today. Thank you, Dominic.
Thank you, Brenton.
Thank you so much, Brenton. Unfortunately, because we're kind of running towards the end of the hour, I'm going to ask all of us to kind of chew on Brenton's really rich and insightful comments on Dominic's paper. Dominic and Brenton will get a chance to discuss this after as well. In the 15 or 20 minutes so that we have remaining, I'd also invite audiences, the audience members to weigh in the chat. I just wanted to say, as a professor of literature, I found your paper, Dominic, so fascinating and really made me sort of rethink what, be conscious about what I'm doing in terms of my classroom. And Brenton, your comments as well, like thinking about the broader philosophical ideas and the potential of earlier texts as well to, bring to bear in our pedagogical experience is really interesting. So there are a couple of comments and questions in the chat. Balbinda Daliwal says, there is a tendency for adults to think that what's happening in politics and society is natural and forget that laws, regulations, and customs were created and supported by those who profit from them. Students learn this from the adults around them. It's a really sort of interesting comment. I don't think there's a question there. We've got two questions from the poet in question, Alvin Pang. I would actually invite Alvin to perhaps take up one question if you want to unmute yourself or come on camera, Alvin, if you want to ask this question of Dominic directly.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Dominic, and congrats on your paper and good luck with your PhD. It's excellent work. I had no idea this particular poem was being studied in schools at all, so it's that's good to know. I had a couple of questions. As Joanne says, you know, we really only have time for one, but I'd love to chat with you about the other questions separately. So the one question I'll pick is really the role of humor, because I think this cuts across both poems. What is the role of humor in ethical discussion of literature in the classroom? Since humor is such an important aesthetic tool, as it were, creative tool in both of these poems, in the form of satire, certainly. You know, the situations that are set up, the dialogues that are set up are meant to be absurd to the point of being funny, right? But you focus on outrage, you focus on the lashback, but I don't get a sense of whether the students pick up at all on the fact that these are meant to be comedic, and the reflection, any ethical reflection that arises from the pieces. They're not lectures, right? They're meant to provoke thinking and ethical reflection in Candles explicitly, because there are two voices, through humor and the contrast between humor and everyday thinking. Could you comment on that, please?
Thank you very much, Alvin. And it's really a privilege to have you here to come on and listen to this also. I want to maybe tie a few threads in maybe 2 or 3 minutes very quickly. Firstly, actually, I can answer your first question very briefly, the one which you didn't raise. The one about, in the poem itself, there's an explicit reference to institutions like the government. There's a thing about the health inspector as well that comes and checks, and the father is just like hiding things underneath the carpet. What I found was that actually students and teachers did not take that part of the poem up very much. And I was in this really weird space where I didn't want to over-determine what was being said in the classroom. I sort of left the teachers and students to approach the poem themselves without intervening too much. And what I found was that there was a little bit of talk about that, and then it just sort of went away. So it was a missed opportunity in that regard. The bit about humor is very interesting for me, because humor is not necessarily a strategy that literature teachers explicitly teach. They teach irony a lot, maybe satire, and that's really the way in that I found. Students have to do this mental gymnastics of figuring out the irony in both poems. And there are cases, there's one other group in Jacqueline's class where the students slowly but surely work their way to the irony. In one group, the students were saying that the terrorist thing, and then they asked like, because it's a Malay student in the class, do you feel like offended by it? And then they go through that bit about talking about the associations of Muslims and terrorists in Singapore. But the bit about humor, I think, is currently still something that is not explicitly taken up by teachers. It usually goes the way of irony when they talk about it. Teachers explicitly talk about satire very much. So that's where I would say I've noticed, at least from the transcripts and the lessons that I've had. Yeah.
Thanks for those questions, Alvin, and for responding, Dominic. There's another question in the chat from Hazira Mohammed, who asks, I'm curious about the choice to cite the study in a middle income and lower middle income setting. Would conducting the study in a higher income student setting it instead be potentially more impactful due to the gulf between the students' social settings and that of the topic being explored?
Thanks very much for that question, Hazira. Actually, I believe I also do engage with your work in another part of the unit when I'm working with Muhammad Latif's poetry as well. It is true that if we just, it's my hunch really, there's a researcher that if this happened in a school that is of a higher income standing, that the responses will likely differ. What was interesting to me was to see what would happen if we put in a mainstream setting actually, and how would students in proximity, and it's also not to assume that students in lower middle income catchment schools are necessarily going to respond the same way as well. So that was one of the things I was interested in when selecting schools and teachers as well, to try this angle instead, to see how illuminating that may be.
Thank you so much. Jing Heng Huang has another question. They write, building on your response to Alvin's first question, may I ask more about your methodology? Were you just a passive observer where you left the students and teachers to their own devices, or was there a more active role that you played?
Thanks very much for that question. That's something that I consciously tried to make myself a wallflower in the classroom. So from the first time I introduce myself, I say that I'm just going to put these devices here. I'm not going to talk in class at all. So even when students are doing group discussions, I don't stand next to them and listen in as well. I just sit at a corner of the classroom the entire time. And where my influence might come is in the design of the unit, but it's not entirely influenced by me either. I do bring in the text. I did shortlist the text, but it is through some discussions with the teachers where I also try to give them some autonomy of how they would bring these texts into the classrooms, and then see how they play out. So there wasn't a pedagogical frame that I imposed on the teachers to begin with. Also, it was just this broad frame. We're going to talk about inequality and privilege. Here's some text. Here's some things that we can maybe explore. But other than that, that's the extent of my direct influence. Yeah.
Thanks, Dominic. You're being very efficient in your answers. So we actually still have some time. I obviously invite audience members if you want to continue populating the chat. But since we have a couple of minutes, actually, because Brenton offers us so much to think about, I was wondering whether you wanted to respond to one or two of his insights.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Renton, for that very illuminating theoretical dive also. I do very much agree with you that Louise Rosenblatt is not just a reader response theorist, although lots of educators like to just zoom in on that. I found that there's a lot of ethical considerations on the part, especially when she talks about adolescent students in literature as exploration, the different versions of that. And probably something that is quite timely for me to revisit also. What I want to maybe look at is, your comment about the stances. Very rightly so. It's a paradox that Levinasian scholars have to grapple with, because the moment you use language to pin down something, then you've just like calcified it, right? Which means that I run the risk of objectifying my students as well. And I think this is inevitable. I see this inevitably across different critiques of Levinasian approaches. There is a critic called Joseph Chronic who really speaks to this conundrum in literary criticism when you take Levinasian approaches. But what I see is that even though, yes, I need to use language to interpret, and the risk is that I fix these and impose these ideas of what students are saying. I'm not in their minds. I don't do phenomenological interviews with them. So how do I sort of work around that? One of the things that I probably have to do is to keep interrupting my own interpretations as well. That's something that I will need to try to keep provisional. And that's also why I call it a continuum, because I didn't pick up on this very much, but Kavita, the student Kavita says, has very receptive bits at one point, hospitably defending, these utilitarian acts.
Yes.
But then in the next class, she goes, but when you talk about privilege like that, it's like as if I have to respond in a certain way. Then she gets very closed up. So what I'm also trying to say is that, there is no, and this also backs up the empirical research, that there's no long-term influence that can be discernible from just having an ethical pedagogy in the classroom. It's very hard to measure that. And what are the implications of that for our case as educators when we say that literary text can make us more empathetic, can make us more human? What's really happening in the classroom is that the same student can say one thing that seems very open in one class, but very closed in the next class. So what do we then make of that? Is where I'm really interested to push as well.
If I could just jump in there, actually now the chat is obviously in the last 4 minutes going crazy.
Yes.
And just picking up from your response to Brenton's so insights into how do you tackle this sort of conundrum dealing with ethical reading. So first we have Waikit Aoyong, who's saying, thinking about how teachers can be more equipped to steer discussions about sensitive ethical issues. In what ways can we support teachers, not just literature teachers, but all teachers, to facilitate such discussions so that students can become more receptive and other-centered, especially with the new Singapore Center for Character and Citizenship Education. And I think that Teo Yu Yen also has a sort of related question to this larger context of building a sort of more ethical readership. She says, thanks for this fascinating talk. I wonder if you could say more about how we should think about this particular literature class in the context of other classes' ideas that students are also engaged in with. Your findings on students not having the language for critiquing inequality, or students who critique political correctness, these seem patterns that may be about their education exposure more broadly and not just about this course. So I'll leave it to you to sort of address the strands in these questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mikey, and Yuan as well for the questions. I have two thoughts, one to each one at the moment. So Mikey, your question really, for me, it speaks to why student responses are so crucial, because a lot of teachers are very reticent to talk about controversial issues or issues where they feel like the conversation in class will spiral out of control. I can't manage my class anymore. What do I do? Right? And one way that maybe we can prepare teachers is to look at patterns of how these kinds of discussions might come out in class, what things tend to occur. And then from there, we can maybe make some targeted suggestions about what we might talk about, what frameworks we might use, because they do vary. And this really bleeds into Yuan's question about, the language about maybe a specific ethical topic. When it comes to inequality, the concepts and if you will, the meta language about critiquing inequality is kind of different, similar but different when we do something about gender, when we do something about race. So maybe there needs to be some, efficacy needed to look at intersectional vocabulary among teachers also, which is something which the teachers in this unit have varying levels of ability and awareness to engage with that. So these two poems, Candles and First World Problems, the teachers decided to couch it under a very broad critique of meritocracy. But very briefly, you might also imagine that just talking about meritocracy and then these two poems, the connection was never always fully made. It would take several steps to get there, but then you might then delve into it becoming a social studies lesson. So when do we then retain the literariness of it? We have to stay with the text still. So it also depends on the context of what classroom we're in. Are we in a literature classroom now? Are we in a social studies classroom now? Are we using a literary text in a social studies class? Are we in a character and citizenship education classroom now? So there are these different contexts, which for me, I'm starting out in the literature classroom, looking at the affordances of literary education as a vehicle for this to happen. But sure, there would be some knock-on effects of how we might think about other classroom contexts too.
Thank you so much. We're exactly at 9 p.m. So kudos to everybody for keeping to time and being but still managing to probe into so many questions. There is one more question, a comment from Tracy Skelton, who says, thank you, this has been very interesting, but I would have liked to see more analysis around poverty, because many children are in a kind of poverty of access to resources. So it's a particular kind of reality alongside the actual text, but point well taken. And if I had time, I'd ask you about the specific social and political context of the Singaporean classroom and the ways in which, the education ministry has different sorts of forms of impact and influence on it, but we don't have time. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us wherever you are in the world. I will say good evening, but I'm sure the rest of you will have a good rest of your day. And thank you again. Please look out for more calls for a Junior Scholars Seminar Series from Academia SG, and have a great time. Thank you, Dominic. Thank you, Brenton. Thank you to all the organizers.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
everyone,
Thank
for
you
your
very
Thank
attention
you.
today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yep.
Excellent.